All right, now that we've finished our discussion about contracts and specifically contracts for the sale of goods, we're going to move on to talk about methods of taking and making payment on those contractual obligations, and those are called negotiable instruments. And then the second half of this chapter will deal with the process of credit and bankruptcy. Now, you're probably already familiar with the concepts of credit and bankruptcy to some extent. Credit is, somebody else's faith in you that you'll pay them back money eventually that they lend you, and all the things that go into, acquiring that faith from other businesses and lenders. And then bankruptcy, of course, is a situation where we've run out of, we're not taking payment, we're not getting many negotiable instruments now, and we've run out of money, and so we have to file for bankruptcy, and when that's appropriate, when it's useful to a business, and how that process works. Now, negotiable instruments, you're probably, or you may not be familiar with that term, but you probably are familiar with the concept if you've ever written a check or you've ever taken a check as payment for something, whether it's just a gift, maybe it's something somebody sent you for your birthday, or it's actually money that they owe you for work that you've done. That is actually a negotiable instrument. It represents one of the two types of negotiable instruments. A check is one that's called a draft, and the other type is called a note. The only difference really is between the two is how many parties are involved. A check is considered a draft negotiable instrument because there's a third party, there's a middleman there, and that is the bank. You are actually ordering your bank to pay somebody money you owe them. With a note, that's more like a loan agreement where there is nobody in the middle. It's just you promising to pay back a lender or somebody else that that you owe money, a certain amount with interest by a certain period of time, whether that's a car loan or a mortgage that you owe in 15 or 30 years. You are promising to pay them back a certain amount of money by a certain time, and that's what makes it a note. The point of negotiable instruments is to, as you can probably imagine, to make payment easier and to make transferring payment from one party to another easier without having to transfer your contractual rights. So we talked briefly about assigning your contractual rights to somebody. You can do that, and they can take whatever you're owed under the contract if you go through that process. But negotiable instruments make it even easier so that you don't even have to do that. So somebody owes me money for something I did for them, but I owe somebody else money. I can simply take the instrument and transfer it to them through the process of negotiation that we'll talk about. And it's very easy to do. It's basically a substitute for cash. And there's other reasons you don't want to carry, the exact amount of cash around that you need to do the deal. If you write a check, you can write a check for $100 or $100,000. You don't want to have to carry around a briefcase of $100,000. There's a couple of reasons you don't want to do that, but you don't want to have to carry that around to complete your transaction. So that's another reason negotiable instruments, make it a little bit easier to do business. Now, let's come down here to our slideshow and talk about specifically what makes a negotiable instrument what it is, what the definition is. So again, just to go back a little bit, it used to be that you couldn't really transfer rights to payment on contracts that where you were owed money. And so this made it difficult for people who, had to wait for somebody else to pay them before they could pay somebody else. Now, the law has evolved to where you can assign contractual rights to somebody else, where you can sort of promise them the money that you're owed before you even get the money by assigning them the rights, and then they'll know that they have a guaranteed right to payment. But a negotiable instrument makes it even easier to transfer that right. As you know, again, with a check, if somebody gives you a check, no matter why they give it to you, if they give it to you as a birthday gift, if you owe somebody money for work they've done, you can sign that over to them. You can transfer it to them, and it's just essentially like transferring cash, in that once they have it, once it's been properly transferred to them, and that's what we call negotiation, when it's been properly negotiated, then they can, that's a guaranteed right to take payment for them. They know that once they have it and it's their check, they can get the cash from the bank. So what is it? Here are the elements that define what makes a instrument negotiable. And just as a side note, the last chapter we were talking about the Uniform Commercial Code, and we were talking about Article 2 specifically. I mentioned that there are many articles that deal with different sections. This is also covered by the Uniform Commercial Code, specifically Article 3. And it tells us how to define what a negotiable instrument is and what makes it negotiable. So number one, you can see it has to be written. It has to be a written document like a check or like a loan agreement. It has to be, number two, an unconditional promise to pay or an order for somebody else to pay. So it can't have any additional stipulations that or conditions that like a contract would have. It's basically once I get it, I can get the money without doing anything else, just like you would if somebody, like you would do if somebody handed you a check. Number three, the amount of money has to be certain, so it has to be a precisely defined amount of money. It has to be signed by the person who's presenting the payment. That's called the maker or the drawer, depending on whether we're talking about a note or a draft. And then it has to be payable on demand at the time that I give you the instrument, or at a specified time. It could be later, but we have to know the date for certain that we can have the guarantee that we'll get the cash. So a check, for instance, can be payable. Usually it's dated the same day that you write it, which means you can take it to the bank immediately and get the cash. But it could be post-dated for the next week, 7 days from now, 10 days from now. But the point is, you know that by a certain date, that money is yours without any other conditions. And then finally, it has to be made out to the order of somebody or to the bearer of the instrument. And so let's just take a look at how this comes into play with, again, a draft instrument, which is a check. Again, the difference between this and a note, which we'll cover also, is the number of parties involved. So here there's a third party in between you and the party that you owe money. So when you write somebody a check, what you're doing is it's an instruction that person is giving to your bank that says, I owe this person money, and I'm ordering you on my behalf to pay them the money that I owe them. Of course, that's assuming that you have the money. As we know, checks can bounce, in which case they won't be getting paid. And that's sometimes why you get a money order or a cashier's check, which we'll talk about in a second. But as you can see there, all the elements are there. We've got a date that's going to be specified. There's going to be a certain sum of money. It is unconditional. There's nothing else in the check. It just says, I'm ordering you to pay this person this money. Sometimes people do put something in the memo line just to document, what it's for. But there's no conditions that can be put in there that, X, Y, and Z have to happen before the person can cash the check. So there's a certain date, a certain amount of money. It's paid to the order of someone. It can also be written, you can write to the bearer of the instrument, or you can write to cash. And that means that whoever has it can take the money. But usually you write it out to a specific person. And that means that person's going to have to sign off on it before it can be transferred to somebody else. And we'll talk about that process when we talk about negotiation. But then finally, it has to be signed, of course, by the person trying to transfer this money, and that's where you'd sign down on the bottom right of the check. Okay, now before we go back, I'm going to end it here, and we'll come back and talk about this process of negotiation and how we go about transferring this form of payment to other people, and what the consequences are of doing that properly or improperly.